about. All right. So, hello, good evening, everyone. I hope I can see you in a second or two. I'm Dr. Kalima Young. I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Electronic Media and Film at Towson University. And this is our 2020 virtual fall film series, Invisible Architectures. The Invisible Architectures is a part of a larger project that I am co-directing with my colleague, Professor Ada Pinkston, who is in the Department of Arts Education, where over the next 3 years, we're going to be putting on programming and providing opportunities for the Towson University community to participate in conversations about truth and reconciliation from various standpoints. So this year's fall film series is Invisible Architectures, and I thought it would be an interesting way to kick off this conversation of truth and reconciliation would be by to think about the kind of language of film and how films and documentaries have handled or talked about the narratives of reconciling unconscionable acts or bringing truth to light or finding and establishing justice for folks. So that is why we have chosen the films that we have chosen this semester. And today's film that we're going to unpack is A Good Day to Die. So this film is directed by David Mueller and Lynn Salt, and it is a film, as everyone who's come knows, that looks at the creation of the American Indian movement, following it through the lens of one of the co-creators, Dennis Banks. Before I get started, I was wondering if folks wanted to introduce themselves, who they might be, who we're all in conversation with today, if you're feeling comfortable with that. I already said my stuff. I'm not saying it again.
Hi, I'm Lynn Tomlinson. I'm a professor in electronic media and film. And I hope I see some of my students maybe here. I'm not sure.
Okay. So,
good evening. I'm Greg Fowler. I'm the Associate Dean of the College of Fine Arts and Communication. And Callum and I have a long history, so we go back a bit. So I'm always excited to be here.
Awesome. I see someone put something in the chat here. Oh, okay. I'm Lenny. I don't have a mic right now, but I'm glad to be here. All right, Lenny, thank you very much for coming in. I'll keep an eye out on the chat to make sure that we are getting all of your insights and thoughts.
I'm Logan. I'm an EMF student.
Hi, Logan. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming in, honey.
Hi, I'm Marty Potenzial. I'm Native American. I work for Colorado Indian tribes, and I thought it was really interesting. I seen Dennis Banks on the event. I usually sign up for stuff that's really relevant. I thought that the movie was relevant to Eventbrite, and that's something interesting. So I only have till 5 o'clock because I'm here and I'm right on the coast, right there on Arizona, California, right on the California border. So I get off at 5. And I'm at work. So I think the thing about it is that for me, the American Indian movement, and it seems like you were talking about how do we have a dialogue for something that's about to reconciliate things, between groups, between people, between laws, between dialogue that starts, and sometimes it's it's a carryover. So I know American Indian movement. I think I have my auntie. My aunt is. I think she's still a part of that organization. And I don't know if I met Dennis Banks. I met Russell Means. He might have passed away, I think, a couple years ago. And there was I think a short film on my auntie and her daughter in Stony Rock, and they were. I think it was called The Indian Women of Stony Rock, and when the NODAPL, Dakota Access Pipeline, when they drilled under, and how that affected the tribes and all a
Yeah.
bunch of other people. So I think this kind of falls right in there. So I'm just going to keep it short.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you popping in from Arizona. Yes, yes. Didn't know we were going to get some West Coast love up in here. So thank you. I see that we have, hi, Nancy. I see you have no mic, but it's nice to see you. Thanks for chatting in the chat. And we've just added in one or two extra folks. So when you feel comfortable, introduce yourself. So the questions I usually have one overarching question when I do a fall film series, and we start from that question and we let the conversation go where it wants to go. So, in light of having watched this documentary, in light of maybe for some folks, it might have been movement history they didn't know anything whatsoever about, or it might have been, I know for me, it was a bit of a reminder of some movement history that I remembered from my early activist days, but I hadn't remembered the details about it. Um, but for some folks, the American Indian movement and this entire experience might be new, or the only entry point that they've had to the justice and activism work that American Indians have been doing in this country. Like their introduction might be the standing right situation. So my question that I wanted, just as the first overall engagement, thinking about the movements and the expertise and the things that were being critiqued in the documentary, A Good Day to Die, is after genocide, what constitutes justice? I know that's a huge question. And if anyone answers that full on, then all of us can retire from public life. But I just like to go with the big question first. So I'll be looking at the chat, and also feel free if you have a mic to unmute yourself and just give me what are your thoughts just to that bigger prompt. And this is the part where I just stare at people until someone says something. Yay, virtual.
You know, that's a really good question. I think the genocide of it. I have to try to remember. I just watched that it was like a documentary on Standing Rock women.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have to find it, but it was really good. It's thought provoking.
Mm-hmm.
It's really has good imagery in there.
Mm-hmm.
The music, the dialogue, I think, is really good in there. The story, the message, and how a very young woman that goes through the whole thing of start to finish, and seeing how, like you said, like when you were an activist, you were an activist.
Mm-hmm.
My niece, I remember her being an activist at University of North Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
They were trying to change the Fighting Sioux name. I think they did finally change it.
Mm-hmm.
Grand Forks, North Dakota, the Fighting Sioux name. She
Mm-hmm.
was there. I remember her. They locked they had like a human chain, you know. They crossed the road, and I remember her in there, and I thought, you know, is there more to come? And I guess her at Standing Rock when that was going on, it seemed like that was something that, you know, she did carry on. But you talked about the genocide in that movie. They were talking about boarding schools.
Mm-hmm.
How it seems like that was a form of genocide, you know. And
yeah.
Myself, I was at boarding school. I went to boarding school in South Dakota.
Wow.
In Flanders, South Dakota, and I went to boarding school there. But I didn't go there because of court, you know, a court order or anything. I went on there on my own because I wanted to get a better education. This was kind of, I think that time and age was way different than the time that people talk about, you know, how genocide kind of,
yeah,
genocide, how that affects.
right.
I think in a sense of knowing that I lived on a reservation, I wanted better education. So lo and behold, I go to a boarding school, and sure enough, I do get a better education.
Right.
You know, I lucked out. I think I was probably one of the many few that lucked out.
Wow. For other folks in the room, how familiar were you with this process of the boarding school process for young folks? on reservations. Was that something you'd been familiar with? Is this something you've been following? Because there's been a lot of conversation of late in the news about doing about some truth and reconciliation around boarding schools and places up north and in Canada. So was that familiar to anyone? Anyone else?
I wasn't aware of that at all
Yeah,
until this movie, until I watched it.
right. So what were your thoughts?
That was probably one of the big surprises for me because I wasn't aware of that at all. Like I knew about how the mistreatment of Native Americans in the country, but I wasn't really aware of that specific fact or even of several other things that they talked about in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was interesting.
Right, right. I think it's really interesting. One of the things that I'm really grabbed is a little bit by, so Dennis Banks's experience of the boarding school situation of being forcibly removed from his home and placed someplace versus making a choice, right? And how those are so very different, right? You give so much more agency when someone makes a choice, but it's still problematic that you have to leave your home to get that, to get a decent education, to leave all of your things for that. I'm looking at somebody in the chat. Yes, from the news in Canada and from literature. Right, right. So thinking about all of the sort of makes and moves that you see as the American Indian movement is taking shape at this particular time and place, the questions for justice, the questions of seeking justice, did they make sense? Did they resonate with you? What are your particular thoughts? What should have, some folks in the documentary seemed like they thought that the fight should be bigger and broader. Some folks felt like it should be more narrow. And I'm just wondering how people might have taken to that part of the documentary.
Well, I mean, for me, maybe not exactly answering your question.
It's okay.
But your primary question here makes me think if justice is even possible, or or is it some sort of partial justice, if that's such a thing. But if such a great wrong has occurred, can it ever be rectified? So that's what I'm trying to work out as
Yeah.
I'm listening to the conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Is that the same thing other folks are sort of, that's coming up for other folks as they look at that prompt? Because I feel like it's one of the major issues that our entire sort of invisible architectures projects is sort of grappling with when things are so huge, especially if it's things that we have a very strange relationship with the past. We think like 5 years ago was a long time ago when it wasn't. Just like we think 45 years ago was a long time ago and it wasn't. So we have a really, time is a strange place, especially in this country, the way that we act about time. So some people think about these things as this was ancient history. So why should we worry about it? Am I making any sense, or am I just preaching? Because y'all can say, Colleen, you preaching.
You're making sense. You're making sense. Keep going.
But that's one of the things I think, when something feels historical or when something feels like it's a long time ago, often people assume that justice has already occurred. And I think by watching the film, you see that that's not the case. Right. What are some other thoughts are crossing that are crossing through people's minds, sort of around the question of how do you make right when something was so horribly wrong?
You know, is it Dr. Young? Or Dr.
That
Clement?
is me. I'm Dr. Young.
Dr. Young. You know, it's this was probably back in the, I want to say, early 80s, maybe.
Mhm.
Maybe early 80s. My auntie Phyllis that's on that Stunning Rock through Eventbrite. She's she was part of the American Indian movement.
Mhm.
So she organized, there was an organization to bring awareness to the Native prisoners in South Dakota. And I don't know if Dennis Banks and Russell Means, and I don't know if they were in prison at the time, but Leonard Peltier was in the in he was in the prison in South Dakota. I think it was Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
hmm
So we, my auntie and a bunch of other people, like part of, I don't know if it was American Indian Movement. It might have been. They organized a called Run for Freedom,
Mm.
and I don't know if it was documented or anything like that, but we ran through all the reservations, part of North
Wow.
Dakota and all of South Dakota, to raise awareness of the prisoners, Native prisoners, including Leonard Peltier,
hmm
or just to show them that there was awareness. So we went on that run. The year before, I think there was this young girl. She was from Parmalee, South Dakota. And I think it might have been a relative to Russell Means, and there was a mishap during the Run for Freedom the year before I was there when I went running, and she got killed. And I think her name was Kim Means,
Wow.
and she ran out. They had caravans, and you would just run on the road, and you just was just bringing awareness to the prisoners of South Dakota,
Right.
the prison, the penitentiary there in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I'm pretty sure it was Sioux Falls. Anyway, that's where Leonard Peltier was. So the year after, there was two people that got killed. Anyway,
hmm
I guess what I don't want to ramble on, but I'm just trying to say is that when we brought awareness to that, I don't know if we were being activists. When we were running, we were young kids. We were like 13-year-olds,
hmm
16-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and then we had a caravan of adults, and
hmm
we ran all through all these reservations. We'd rest at nighttime, get up and do the same thing over. Finally,
Right.
we get to see the prisoners, and I remember seeing we got to shake their hands, and they were in prison,
hmm
and we got to see Leonard Peltier, and
Wow.
but when we went to Parmalee, they had like a memorial
hmm
for his relative,
Right.
and it was quite moving. It was quite moving when you have maybe about 100 people running, and like all in unison,
hmm
all running in unison. Just you can hear just their feet.
Yeah.
The feet moving, the gravel's hitting. You can hear the breath of people's breathing. Then we're coming into this area where all these elderly women are, and
Yeah.
they're all crying
Yeah.
because we represent, part of something that we're a part of. We're young. We don't even know what we're a part of, but we
Mm.
represent. When we get there, and it's real sad. It's real sad, So I
Yeah.
think in a sense of they knew exactly what was going on. We didn't know. We were
Hmm.
just
So you were participating in the activist event, but you kind of didn't know, but the people around you understood. But you still felt the power from it, right?
yeah.
Yeah. Has anyone else in the room had those kinds of experiences in activist settings? I know for myself. I remember Hands Across America in 1984, if anybody remembers that. I signed up for that officially because I was like, I want to be a part of this. And I'm like, we're going to end homelessness by holding hands. And the guy whose hand I was holding was very, very, very sweaty handed. And I was just like, is this really how I do activism? Holding a sweaty dude's hand. But it was a beautiful introduction into mass activism that I chose. Like my mom didn't choose it. I chose it. I was like, I want to do this because we need to stop homelessness. Thanks. I don't know,
I
Greg,
think
you
that's
unmuted.
I think that's it. I mean, it's an important point that Marty raises, I think, in the sense that there has to be awareness and recognition of the wrong of the genocide before there can be any movement towards justice, right? So there is a process involved here because there
Right.
are so many events that at least American history buries or we're unaware of, right? And it's only when we are made aware of them that we can seek restitution and reconciliation of any type.
Yeah. No, definitely. Definitely. I think, and I would love for anyone else to sort of weigh in on this, but I think sometimes we stop at awareness, and that's one of the questions that I wonder about, right? When do we just stop at awareness and think that that's enough? And how does awareness start translating into structural or like institutional changes? And I think oftentimes we kind of get stuck in one particular space on that, but that's just something that I see in certain other kinds of movements. I'm wondering if anybody else has some thoughts on it. Like after awareness, what's next? And is it okay if we just stay in the space of, oh, at least we're going to unearth like histories and things that folks don't know about? I think there are so many, especially if you're thinking about the American Indian movement. I think that there are so many histories that we just don't know, and policies and ways that we make connections and different treaties and the way those treaties have been destroyed, right? Or not
Yeah,
made aware. Yeah, go ahead, Lynn, please.
it's reminding me, my daughter did a research paper on the Supreme Court case. I think it was called, it was couple versus baby girl. I can't remember, but it was a baby girl who was adopted.
Mhm.
And it was a whole very complicated situation where her father was identified with a tribe and her mother was not. And then she was adopted by another couple. I guess it was called Adopted Couple v. Baby Girl. And at first it seemed very clear that she should be with the adopted couple, but the more we read about this situation, I mean, it was fun doing the research with her to learn all about the Supreme Court and how they consider this so seriously. But you know, as you learned more about the treaties and that this is actually another nation that we're dealing with,
Mhm.
and that, you know, it just became suddenly our opinions started to shift, and we started to think, no, I see why this is, you know, this could be considered differently. That the and just to think about Native American nations as you know, that we have treaties and we have to abide by that. It shifted my way of thinking.
Right.
And so it's interesting to think about it that way.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you bringing that up, right? I think
Mhm.
the conversation of nations, I don't, in my PhD program, we talked a lot about how nations are arbitrary and borders are arbitrary, right? And nothing is more concrete. Nothing is more like clear that nations are a concept. But until it becomes much more clear when you think about the American Indian movement and you think about Native nations, like that we live in a country where people don't realize that we're living in a country within many different countries, right? And if there were just like, I think a huge awareness campaign would be making people truly understand the implications, like you just said, Lynn, right? When you started really taking that in, it changed and shifted your narrative about what you thought was like just for this young woman and her story, right? Anybody else? What thoughts are crossing your mind? Let me see. Adoptive couple versus baby girl. Okay. I'm gonna look that up. Thank you for putting it in the chat. I don't want to randomly like call on people, but I might randomly call on people. You don't want that from me. You don't. Maybe if we shift gears, it would be really great to hear what and read and see what elements of the documentary stood out for you, what you thought was really interesting, what's new information that you weren't familiar with from watching it.
For me, it was mostly just learning about the history of the treatment of Native Americans in this country, because, like I said earlier, I wasn't really familiar with this until I wasn't or like I knew the details of it, but I didn't really have an in-depth familiarity with it.
Mhm.
So this movie helped me learn a lot about it.
Mhm. I was particularly struck by the title cards that they were putting in between that would give statistics about poverty and about people who were incarcerated. That you could have, I think one of the statistics that stood there was like meeting like 70% of a population in a particular town, all of these people being imprisoned in that space. So taking up a small amount of space in the town, but being the majority of folks that were in prison and all those other kinds of things. Let me see. Nancy, I forgot that the Native Americans called off the Wounded Knee conflict because they didn't want anyone else to die. Yes. Yes. Huh. Right. That's a little piece of history. Go ahead, Greg.
For me, I remembered Wounded Knee, but I didn't recall, and I don't think I ever heard about the conflict that occurred in Custer. That was
Oh.
that conflict was news to me. So that was a sort of a precursor to Wounded Knee in some ways. So I thought that was a new bit of news.
It's an interesting reminder, right, that this particular space held so much history. So they were doing a reclamation of that space, right? On top of a space. So it has a double layers of trauma in the particular soil of that space. I think that's something I think about an awful lot too. And the confrontation, the standoff in Wounded Knee in the documentary made me think a lot about that too, about the power of place to hold trauma and what we do that we tap into it sometimes and it creates more ripples, right? Let me see. Other folks, anything else that popped up for you as you were watching it?
I was, with Greg's talking about
Mhm.
Custer, I know that I know, I think it was my father or my mother told me that when that happened with Custer, there was all kinds of different tribes. There was Arapaho, Sioux, and other tribes. They gathered a bunch of, they gathered a lot of horseback riders, and they were real slick with fighting. So as you know how that goes, that rolls out with Custer. When they kind of lured them in, they lured in, and it was they knew it was a general. So when they killed his men, a general, they killed a general. They knew what they were doing, how they killed them, and there was a lot of history that it was just verbal, passed down. So with Custer, they just wounded him. They left the women. They let the women kill him.
Wow.
The women, killed him, which was the women pretty much took the body parts, killed him very
Wow.
slow, at the grassy green in Montana, the Little Bighorn. And it was they took the American flag. That was the war they lost. The United States lost that war against Sioux, Arapaho, the other tribes. And they kept that flag.
Wow.
So they always said that in the history of the American flag, the flag then belonged to Native Americans. From that point on,
Wow.
they fought the war. And I remember, just kind of going off the subject, but I remember the Chicago Bulls coach talked about how they lured in Custer and they killed off his men. And I think it was Phil Jackson talked about and taught his basketball team with Michael Jordan. He kind of, he had them read books, and he talked about how some of that history played out at Little Bighorn, and I don't know if I'm not sure how that kind of went with his teaching, with how he taught basketball.
Yeah.
I think it was just some of the things in there that made sense to him, that made sense to Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and to all those other, those players in there that I think Phil Jackson talked about. Because I know Phil Jackson went to school in Grand Forks, North Dakota, and that's where I graduated. I graduated from UND, and I remember him coming back there. I think he came back one time, and I didn't see him, but he
Mhm.
was there, Phil Jackson. I think that's where he finished school, or he graduated, and he went
Wow.
on to be a big time basketball player.
That's interesting where we find our inspiration for our stories, right? So that he would actually use that story as the inspiration to get that team to keep winning and to like push through. That's an interesting moment. Yeah. What other
And
conversations? Yeah.
I want to tell you one more thing because I got to leave
Yeah.
pretty soon. But,
Okay.
I remember my grandmother telling my mom when they were young, and my mom told me this. So my grandmother's, I think their family's from Nakota, from Canada.
Mhm.
So they were, when Wounded Knee was happening, the first one, when the, cook, when they took the Gatling guns
Mhm.
and they pulled the sheet away from them, and they start just gunning down all the Indians, the 300 plus elderly women, children, the
Mhm.
sick there, Wounded Knee. I think my grandma was, I want to say, I don't know how true this is, but I think my grandma, Benedicta Buffalo Boy, was there. It was either her mom or it was her.
Wow.
But I remember her telling my mom, saying that, they're killing Indians over there, and you need to run. You need to run now. So they were grabbing all these kids and they were running. And that was, I guess she remembered that because she was saying, we never knew about killing, we never knew that people can kill people, we were
Yeah.
that young, and they were talking about that. And that was Wounded Knee. You need to go to these creeks, these big deep creeks, these draws. You got to hide yourself in there,
Yeah.
and because they're killing Indians over there. I don't know where that was. It was either my grandmother's mother, or it was my grandmother, because she was born in the 1800s. I
Wow.
can't remember when all that happened. I remember her telling us that, and it always stuck in my mind. And I remember when we were on the Run for Freedom, we went there. We went to the Wounded Knee, and all of us runners were there. And we didn't know anything about it. It
Mhm.
was just hollow ground, and it was just real sacred, and
Yeah.
it meant something to somebody.
Mhm.
They prayed, and they told us, that this was sacred ground. So we
Right.
were all young, so we had some times there to think about things, I guess. And it's really interesting how I don't even know. I guess I was part of history, I'm part of something,
Mhm.
and I remember it after I get older now. So I turned 55 last month, so I'm not a spring chicken no more. So
You're springy enough. You good. You good. I think it's really interesting, though. I like this one thing that's standing out for me is this conversation about oral histories, right? The myths that people pass down, the story lore that passes down from family to family to family. And I think that oftentimes when we're talking about trying to find justice for something that is large, something that feels almost out of time, a lot of that has to do with the kind of stories that we tell and the stories that we pass down, and what elements of the stories stay, which elements of the stories get expanded or get smaller. Um, and how for many people and many groups, and especially marginalized groups, storytelling is the primary way that people are able to keep their histories, because it's not going to be in the history book that you're going to read in school, right? I think about that in terms of the stories that my mom told, right? She grew up a sharecropper, South Carolina, with her brothers and sisters, like picking tobacco, and the family lore that we have from that, because none of the histories of how our family lost our farmland and it became sharecroppers and all that, none of that is like written in history books, but it's all part of family lore. right? And when we keep family lore alive by talking to one another, we keep bits of history alive. And I think that can be considered parts of justice as well, right? Is making sure those stories keep living. So thank you, Marty, for sharing. We really appreciate that. Even from the West Coast, all in like weird time and stuff. That's awesome. Does anyone else have any sort of observations they'd like to bring to the forefront so we can chat about them?
I guess I liked it what you just said about the stories being part of justice rather than just awareness, because I was thinking about the Mosaic project that I sent to you, Colin, and how
Mhm.
art projects we can do could be a way that we bring, I would say, awareness, but maybe it's more than just awareness to these issues. Because
Mhm.
I don't know. I wasn't thinking that it was part of justice. I was feeling like maybe we were just telling the happy stories or like the conflicting stories. But if we were to make a project as part of Invisible Architectures that celebrates stories, is that part of justice or is that just awareness?
Right. Oh, that's a good question. Is that justice or is that, oh, who wants to answer that? I don't know if I got the answer to that, but I like that question, Lynn. What y'all thinking? I'm gonna mind you all for data. Anybody got thoughts? And I'll look at the chat too. You can put it in the chat.
I guess I'm not thinking that they're mutually exclusive.
Okay.
A project that Lynn is describing could certainly do both depending on the individual involved or the individual interacting with the work.
Mm.
That's kind of a weak answer, but that's where my head went.
That's not a weak answer. That's an answer. I guess they could be both.
Maybe
Okay.
by enabling
you.
people's stories to be public.
Appreciate it.
Oh, bye. Thank you.
Awesome. Yay.
Yeah, but yeah,
That was cool.
we've often talked about counter narratives, but I think Lynn's right. At some point, that it becomes part of the justice. But I guess I'm trying to think where that tipping point is, and I don't have an answer for that.
I often think about the stories as, and this is probably just my arbitrary thinking, but I think we pop into the justice part when we have awareness that that part of the story has been purposefully erased. Like not just invisible because people didn't share it, but that it's been purposefully erased. When I think about that, I think about Confederate monuments, right? And how at first they started as just like memorials for those who were passed, like the poor soldiers who died in the war, the Confederate soldiers. And then how it started shifting so that suddenly we have these big things that are the history of why they're there in those spaces were lost or taken away on purpose so that we just don't grapple with it the same way. So I think that might be a little bit of it. I see Francine says they're both. All right, Francine, thank you. I'm looking at the chat and looking at y'all. But I think that might be a part of it, is when someone willfully goes out of their way and says, I'm going to erase it, and then you bring it back. Greg?
Well, we talked about that, I think, last year with in terms of the Tulsa massacre 101 years ago now, right?
Mm-hmm.
That when Watchmen was out on Netflix, there were something like hundreds of thousands of people Googling Tulsa massacre because no one heard about it, right? That willful hiding of it,
Right. Right. It's the no one heard of it, but there's all of us, I don't know, all the Black people I knew heard about it. We knew. We've been done heard that, right? So who is the no one, right? Who is the invisible audience that we're always thinking is innocent of thought, right? That gets complicated too. So I'm listening, I'm thinking about, I'm sort of trying to get a handle of sort of the curves of this conversation that we've had. And I'm looking back at the prompt, like after genocide, what constitutes justice? So I say that one of the things that we're defining is storytelling, right? So I think one thing we've identified is maybe some storytelling. Another thing that we've identified is awareness, and those aren't storytelling and awareness aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. And that the storytelling and the passing on can take many different flavors, right? Is there anything else, just thinking about the multiple tactics that Dennis Banks and those involved in that moment in the American Indians movements did? Are there any other tactics that y'all thought or saw and you said, yeah, that makes sense to tackle it that way, or that's the way you think justice is done?
Well, there was something they talked about a number of times, and I wish I could. I think they called it confrontational politics.
Hmm.
Yeah. So the tactic that they seem to be using there would be something that could be embraced.
Hmm. I think we see a lot of confrontational. I think when I think about, okay, so let's think about confrontational politics. Can we think of any modern examples, any more recent examples of that come to mind?
Me Too movement.
Well, tell me more. How?
Um, I'm thinking about the newspaper story. I think it was New York Times that basically exposed Harvey Weinstein. Even though, of course, there were so many people who already knew, about his assaults, but this was, it came to a head, with this article, and so, and then the movement was, spurred on by Hollywood, but also brought along, women who were not in the public eye to tell their stories and to show how, ubiquitous sexual assault is. And so I just felt that that moment of Me Too was very confrontational. I didn't watch the movie, so I'm assuming it's in the same vein, but I'm looking for others to let me know.
Yeah.
That seems like an important point. It's the accretion of stories as you build a critical mass of shared stories that can
Mhm.
lead to the confrontation.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, no, I think you got a point there. Like the you build it up to it becomes, it's so big that it can't be invisible anymore, right? It can't be an open secret anymore because everyone's adding to it and more air in the room, adding more air, and you're seeing it, and then boom, it comes out. So you have to get a critical mass with it. I've been thinking a little bit when I think, and I don't know if folks would see it as confrontational politics, but you know how a part of like the Black Lives Matter movement has been different versions of sort of getting people while they're out in the world. So like you would have the brunch call outs that would occur. So people are in a specific place and then a group of activists would come in and they call out injustice in that space. I think sometimes that's considered confrontational politics. I see you unmuted, Francine. Did you have some thoughts on that, hon?
No, I would agree with that, and I also wanted to add, just thinking more about the stories being a part of justice. I just, as we're talking and I'm thinking about it, it makes more and more sense to me, because the stories are coming from the people who are directly involved, and that's what I see as a critical piece of justice, that it's initiated from the people who have been marginalized, who have, undergone the oppression,
Mm-hmm.
experienced it, and so it, to me, it makes sense that the stories are a part of it. It's not the only piece of it, because, um, of course, we know there's just bigger restitution that should happen, but that should also come from and decided by, the people who have experienced, the oppression as well. So
Word. I think one of the things in the documentary that I found interesting that works along in your thread, Francine, and Greg's thread, is that moment where Dennis Banks is just like, so he's talking about the movements that are happening in the later 60s. And he's just like the women's movement, and we see the Black movement, we have all these things, but no one's talking about Native Americans, right? So that often confrontational politics or activism comes to be when we're swimming in a sea of it and we don't see our part of that story being told, right? So seeing activism on other things, it often inspires folks to say, oh, hold on, we've got these sets of injustices that are hanging out, the same kind of the government mechanisms and the courts and the laws and things of that nature and stuff around poverty and education, that's impacting us too. And we have activist work to do. That like all of our, I guess that justice is always constantly building. And we need to we see one thing and it's inspiring another and inspires another. And you realize that your perspective is not being told, even when there's masses of activism happening around it. And I thought that was really interesting to watch that as the documentary was unfolding. That he's just like, hey, hold on, we're having all these issues too, but no one's talking about Native American politics and oppression. And it wasn't like, oh, we're going to go to the NAACP and say, hey, could y'all add us to the agenda? No, they made it their own movement and borrowed and were inspired by the tactics, right? So that goes back to the bubbling up from those who are being oppressed.
I wonder, or I am wondering, how much geography plays into this, in the sense that where the American Indian movement took root and grew primarily, it was in a rural, in a very rural area, as opposed to, and the kind of quote unquote media coverage it would receive. I mean, would it have been different if it had been an Onondaga tribe in New York, close to New York City? Would that have been a different dynamic?
It's interesting you bring that up, because I feel like that same kind of question to some extent is one that we'll be wrestling with in the final film that we're watching in the series, which is 3 Billboards in Ebbing, Missouri, right? Like when you're in a space where you're far removed from where the media is paying attention, how do you get them to listen? How do you get folks to listen to like this bigger story if you're not in those larger spaces, if you're not in the urban corridor on the East Coast or whatever, right? So I think you definitely, spatial relationships have a lot to do with it as well. I think also we kind of, the way that we narrated sort of social justice stories, unless we don't really look at the many different social justice movements that have been and continue and always have been occurring all at the same time, right? Is activism always just the way that we see it, or does activism show up in a different way? Right? Smaller ways, everyday ways, right? What does that look like? We are getting ready to sort of close this out, but in the last couple of minutes, I wanted to just sort of open up the channels for folks to add their thoughts or other perspectives that they might have, having viewed A Good Day to Die, and having sort of thought about movement politics that you might not have been as familiar with. Are there any remaining thoughts that are crossing your mind? Other than how lucky we were to have Martin Pretends Eagle come in and give us some serious Native history from the West Coast. I'm like, what? Go film series, yay. Okay, but anyway, that's very happy. That was very fun. But yeah, what are some thoughts, some extra thoughts that might be going on? Do you feel like you have a, or maybe I can, as we think about the concept of truth and reconciliation, do you see where this film fits? Do you feel like it's a part of that conversation? Maybe. I don't know if that's a good enough question. I'm playing here. I'm spitballing, homies.
Yes, I mean, I think this is a good start, particularly if we think about even what we're doing at Towson in terms of trying to recognize the Native American lands that the university sits on. So that starting with this as the quote unquote original peoples of this continent, it seemed like a perfectly logical and effective place to start to me.
Right. And then what happens next? Right? After we acknowledge, then what happens next? That's the big question. And yeah, how do we shift power when the injustice has been so long and so deep, and structures and institutions and customs and other things have been layered on top of the injustice, right? It's a giant ball to try to unpack. But we've got 3 more chances. Ha ha. So that's right. Segue. All right. So the film that we are working with, that we are going to be watching next week in the fall film series, is a fictive story called The Forgiven. It stars Eric Bana and Forrest Whitaker as Desmond Tutu. And it's an interesting conversation. It's a look at one member of apartheid South Africa, a political member who was one of the major politicians in apartheid South Africa, talking to Desmond Tutu and asking for forgiveness and absolution for the policies and things that took place under his watch. So I think it's a really interesting movie to think about as we're talking about truth and reconciliation, as South Africa is one of the only countries that has had a full-on truth and reconciliation process. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means when it's a federal sort of state nations-based truth and reconciliation process. That there are courts and there are people and there are trials and things of that nature. And our guest, we will have a guest speaker with us for next week. It's Professor Mokwe Sae Siade. Gosh, Sialwe. Thank you. I always get that last part wrong. Anyway, Professor Mokwe in the theater department, awesome, awesome, awesome. From South Africa, has been doing a whole lot of work, knows things about truth and reconciliation, its process inside and out. So I'm really looking forward to having her with us next Monday at 7:30 so that we can unpack The Forgiven. But for now, thank you everyone who showed up today and participated. Thank you for chatting in the chat, and I'm getting up in it. And I really hope to see you again next week so we can unpack another story of truth and reconciliation. All right. Thank y'all all.
Thank you.
Peace,
Have a
peace.
good night.
Good night.
Oh wait, just be sure. So where will we be able to see this recording?
This recording of this conversation that just occurred,
Yeah.
that will eventually, probably within the next week or so, that will be on our collab page on the Towson University website.
Okay,
So it's the collab project Invisible Architectures.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for participating. Appreciate it.
All right. Bye.
Cool. All right. Okay. Boom. And we